Thank you very much. That was beautiful reading. Most appreciative. Shabbat shalom to everyone. Good to be with you this morning, even at this needed distance. Relatively short offering for you this morning. Not too short, just relatively speaking, perhaps. So I want to start with a story that I've told in our Thursday Talmud class, but not here, at least not for a while. It's a story I recall from my year in Israel as a rabbinical student. A beloved teacher was our instructor for a codes or Jewish law course. And once we were studying a text, and one student, not me, thankfully, and you'll see why I'm thankful it wasn't me this time in just a moment. He said, "You know, this text gives me a great idea for a sermon that I want to give one day." And the teacher stopped the class and said, "I want to tell you something. This class is not about giving you material for your sermons. If you study so that you'll have something to say, then you'll constantly be thinking about how these texts are connected to something else. And that's going to distract you from diving deeply into the texts themselves. Our study here is for its own sake, so we can meet these texts directly and understand them for what they are teaching us and not as fodder for your future sermons." And I've always tried to keep that in mind and to do at least some learning without consciously thinking on a parallel track about how this text might be eventually shared. But with the opportunity to speak and teach frequently, whether here or the past number of weeks and the past 21 years in Chavrat Shabbat, where we have recently celebrated a number of COVID-safe B'nai Mitzvah, it is hard to filter out that voice while learning anything. That voice that calls out, "Hey, this would be really great in a sermon." I hope my teacher doesn't mind that I'm about to violate his rule. It is in many ways due to the positive influence and example of our president, Ed Sofer, that I have also delved into the Daf Yomi, a page of Talmud a day cycle of learning that takes over 7 years to complete. I've been reticent to share that with you because I didn't know if I would have the fortitude to see it through, and I guess, to be fair and honest, I still don't. But we're now close to a year in, and I haven't missed a day, so I hope maybe I will be blessed to continue along with tens, if not hundreds of thousands of others. We spent the last 3 months, 105 days to be precise, on Tractate Eruvin, which deals mostly with the laws of carrying and how far you can travel on Shabbat. It was, how shall we say it? It was a long slog. But the reward at the end of those 105 days is the beginning of Tractate Psachim, the rabbinic development of the observance of Passover, which, with apologies to my teacher, I think will be a lot more relevant. Like all tractates, there are asides and streams of conscience, and there was one this week on the exactitude and the inexactitude of language. On the one hand, a very Talmudic expression, we should say what we mean and mean what we say. On the other, this is of course why God gave us 2 hands, we are instructed to sometimes speak indirectly, even euphemistically, especially in order to emphasize modesty and kindness, and to try to avoid embarrassing anyone unnecessarily. In dealing for a full page with the correct understanding of the Hebrew word or, Aleph Vav Resh, the Talmud goes on a tangent about when you are better off being inexact with your language. For instance, the Torah tells us that a man who is ritually impure who rides on a saddle, well, that saddle will also now be ritually impure. But when it tells us about the parallel case of a woman, the Torah says that what will be impure is anything on which a similarly impure woman sat. Why riding for a man and sitting for a woman? Because in that part of the world, at that time, the image of a woman riding on a donkey was considered to be somewhat immodest. So to reinforce the use of discreet language that was meant to motivate humble action, the Torah describes these similar circumstances in slightly different ways. But purposefully imprecise language is not used only for modesty. It can also be employed to make sure to speak positively in general and to avoid overly negative language. While I was developing this, I was reminded of the stories of the Lubavitcher Rebbe, who to his credit would not use language with negative connotations. For instance, he would not refer to a hospital as a Beit Cholim, a place for the sick, but rather as a Beit Refuah, a place for healing. He disliked the term deadline and would instead say due date for its association with birth. He would not use the term retreat, even for a spiritual or learning-oriented convention, because retreat implies going backwards. And even though he was pretty much the pioneer of the Baal Teshuvah movement, which literally means a master of repentance, he never used that term, since it insinuated that this person had done something wrong that required repentance. And that list goes on for a long time. Maybe, I don't know, but maybe he was channeling the Talmud at the beginning of Psachim, a text he certainly knew well, which teaches if you have a question about harvesting olives, and I know you do, ask, by what reason does one need not harvest olives in a state of ritual purity? Rather than, by what reason may one harvest olives in a state of ritual impurity? And if anyone asks you if your wheat crop developed nicely and you know it did not, don't say the wheat crop did not develop nicely, but instead say the barley crop developed nicely, and let them figure it out from there. One last example from the Talmud reminds me of one of the great English language jokes I know. It's one of my favorites and one of my mother's least favorites, for reasons you'll see in a moment. I told it a few years ago in a sermon on the Holy Days, so I'm sure you remember it, both the joke and the sermon. It's a bit of a shaggy dog story, so I won't do the whole thing here, but you can Google it if you want. It's about the guy who goes on vacation and asks his brother to watch his cat. And he calls from the road and asks, how's my cat? And his brother says, your cat is dead. And the brother who's traveling complains, why'd you start with that? You should have told me more gently. You should have said the cat got stuck on the roof. And then say, we can't get the cat down. And then say, the cat didn't make it. But live and learn. I forgive you. So tell me, how's mom? Well, mom got stuck on the roof. Who knew that the Talmud set the foundation for this joke? Albeit with a much more serious story. I'll paraphrase to make it a little easier to follow. It involves a very coded conversation between two rabbis who are related, Rav and Rabbi Chia, but who had not seen each other in a long time. When they meet, this is their conversation. Rabbi Chia asked Rav, is your father alive? Rav responded to Rabbi Chia with a question. Is your sister alive? Rabbi Chia answered Rav with a question. Indeed, is she alive? Rav responds with a final leading question to Rabbi Chia: is my father alive? And from this indirect, also very Talmudic conversation, Rabbi Chia understands that both are no longer living. And Rav never had to say it explicitly. Rather, he broke the news very gently as he could, in what was no doubt a very difficult situation for both of them. In our Parashat Vayetze, the extended exchange between Lavan and Jacob as Jacob flees his father-in-law's house is full of leading and misleading language, even outright lies. I did not go and map it out, but I think possibly other than the Joseph story, it is the longest single unit story since Abraham came on the scene back in Lech Lecha, stretching some 57 verses. I think the Torah is calling us to pay attention. Lavan makes veiled and not so veiled accusations. Jacob gives direct and emotionally charged answers. Each seems to be saying something without saying it, with Lavan both yelling at Jacob for fleeing under the cover of night, but perhaps also as a subtext saying, Jacob, you came to my home, and yes, I deceived you into marrying my older daughter, but now you're taking them both away from me, and that's painful for me. And Jacob responds in what may be an overly defensive manner, saying how hard he worked for Lavan and how he was always fair and took any losses as his own, while not mentioning that he also just a few verses earlier employed some subterfuge himself in order to make sure he left Lavan's household as a wealthy man. He does not mention this part, but instead glosses over it in righteous indignation. It should not surprise us that biblical figures sometimes say exactly what they mean and sometimes obfuscate or skirt around some inconvenient realities, because I know that I sometimes do both of those things, and maybe you do too. Perhaps Jacob did so to protect his family. Perhaps Lavan did so to save face in the aftermath of his daughters separating from him and his household. Maybe we always remember to say not just the right thing, but the right thing in the right way. And if we don't, then we can remind each other that both matter. We should neither always say everything we think just because we think it, nor should we fail to consider the way just about any words we say will land on someone else. We probably won't be able to be quite as careful, nor perhaps should we, as Rav and Rabbi Chia, or even the last Rabbi. But I hope you would agree that their lessons in this way can point us all in a positive direction. I recently taught some of our wonderful Mirachnik religious school parents a bit of a more advanced lesson on kashrut to follow up on a more basic lesson they had together with their kids. It is amazing how many laws of what we should and should not eat and drink the rabbis squeezed out of a very small amount of Torah text. Why did they do that? We surmised it was because we eat frequently, second only perhaps to breathing, and maybe one other thing. If Judaism is to be relevant to our lives, of course it has to address that which we do most often. So what is that thing we do more often than eating? For most of us, it is talking or otherwise communicating our thoughts to others. So it is necessary that Judaism has a lot to say about what we say, and the occasional reminder to strive to take these guidelines to heart, to learn about them and strive to put them into practice is, I hope, appropriate. Our natural environment can be repaired by refraining from filling it with known pollutants. So too, our mental environment, full of toxicity that starts with words, can be cleansed. It can be made more hospitable with kind acts, and those should be accompanied by kind, considered, and thoughtful words, right for the situation right for the moment, and hopefully right with God. Shabbat Shalom. Continue with Musaf, which begins Chatzi Kaddish, page 155.
Koach, Rabbi.